Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a document on your desk this evening? A letter unopened, a page half read? In the quiet chambers of Lincoln's Inn, Watson once learned that even a single sheet of paper can imprison a man or set him free. The most dangerous disguises, he observed, are not wigs or false beards, but polished names and reputations accepted without question. Do subscribe, so no story escapes you. You'll also find us on Spotify. The link is just below. Now, settle in. For truth, patiently observed, cannot remain hidden forever. Chapter 1. A Petition from Lincoln's Inn. It has long been my conviction, formed through years of close association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most instructive of his cases were not those which led us into the shadowed courts and rookeries of the East End, nor into the fog-choked alleyways where crime wears its most familiar face. Rather, it was in those matters where respectability itself was the disguise, where the perpetrator moved through drawing-rooms and legal chambers with the ease of a man entirely above suspicion, that Holmes's faculties were most brilliantly engaged. I have known him to be indifferent to a sensational poisoning in Mayfair, and yet animated to a degree bordering upon joy by a forgery conducted in Chancery Lane. The polished and the plausible I came to understand were the true theatre of his genius. It was in the second week of November, during one of those grey still afternoons when London seems to hold its breath beneath a sky the colour of pewter, that the case I have chosen to set down here first announced itself at our Baker Street rooms. Holmes had spent the morning in a condition of restless abstraction, alternating between his violin and a monograph he had been drafting upon the chemical properties of wood ash residue. I had long since learned to leave him undisturbed in such moods, and was myself occupied with the morning papers, finding little in them to arrest attention, save a brief notice of parliamentary proceedings, and a somewhat melodramatic account of a riverside accident at Greenwich. Mrs. Hudson knocked at 2:30. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced with that admirable economy of expression which I have always associated with her. "A young gentleman. He appears quite agitated." Holmes laid down his bow. His grey eyes sharpened instantly, that particular quality of alertness coming into them, which I had come to recognise as the first movement of a mind shifting from repose to occupation. "Show him up, if you please, Mrs. Hudson." The young man who entered our sitting-room a moment later was perhaps 7 or 8 and 20, slight of build, and possessed of that indefinable air of the Inns of Court, which distinguishes the junior barrister even before he opens his mouth. His dark coat was well cut but carelessly worn, his cravat slightly loosened, and his hat, which he turned repeatedly in his hands without apparently noticing the action, bore the marks of recent rough weather. His features were open and earnest, not unintelligent, and at this moment thoroughly distressed. "Mr. Holmes," he said, coming forward with an abruptness that suggested he had rehearsed a more measured introduction, and abandoned it at the last moment. "My name is Edward Harcourt. I am a junior barrister attached to the chambers of Sir Julian Merryweather, Queen's Counsel, at Lincoln's Inn. I have come to you because I am at an absolute loss, and because I am told by those whose opinions I respect that you are the one man in London capable of assisting me." Holmes indicated the basket chair opposite with a gesture of his hand. "Sit down, Mr. Harcourt. You have come from Lincoln's Inn within the last half hour. You have walked at least part of the way despite the weather, and you are labouring under considerable nervous strain. Pray allow yourself a moment before you begin." Harcourt sat, blinked, and appeared momentarily taken aback. Then he drew a long breath, and composed himself with evident effort. I placed my notebook quietly upon my knee, for long experience had taught me that the early details of a consultation were often more significant than they appeared. "I will be direct," Harcourt said. "A document of the most serious legal consequence has gone missing from Sir Julian's chambers, a writ of habeas corpus." Holmes said nothing, but his fingers came together at their tips in the attitude I knew well. "The writ," Harcourt continued, "concerns a man named Samuel Bellamy. He He's a political pamphleteer, a quiet and, in my judgment, entirely honourable man who was arrested some 3 weeks ago under what I can only describe as suspicious and inadequate grounds. Sir Julian agreed to take up his cause without fee, believing firmly that the arrest was an abusive process. The writ was prepared with great care, signed, witnessed, and sealed. It was to have been presented to the court officer last evening. And it was not presented, said Holmes. It was not. When the folder was opened at the appointed hour, the writ was gone. In its place was an old and entirely unrelated pleading, of no consequence whatsoever. The writ itself has vanished as completely as though it had never existed. I leaned forward slightly. And without the writ, what becomes of Bellamy? He remains in prison. Harcourt's voice carried a controlled anger in it now. Moreover, there is a separate proceeding under preparation, one designed, I believe, to destroy his reputation and strip him of what modest property he possesses. Every day he remains confined is a day that process advances unopposed. Whoever took that writ knew precisely what they were doing and why. Holmes had risen and moved to the window. He stood with his back to us for a moment, looking out at the grey street below. When he turned, his expression was one I recognised as a kind of suppressed curiosity, the look of a man who has heard the first bar of a symphony he suspects will prove interesting. You say the chambers are orderly. Describe the arrangement. Harcourt did so with commendable precision. Sir Julian's chambers occupied a set of well-appointed rooms in Lincoln's Inn, maintained according to a strict and unvarying routine. Documents were entered in a register upon arrival, copied where necessary, locked in appropriate boxes or folders at the close of business, and produced only upon formal request. The writ had been placed by Sir Julian himself into a blue brief folder upon his desk at 6 o'clock the previous evening, to be collected at 7 for delivery to the court officer. In the intervening hour, a small dinner had taken place at a neighbouring club, attended by Sir Julian and several colleagues. The chambers had not been left entirely unattended, but the precise movements of all present during that hour were, as Harcourt admitted with some discomfort, not entirely accounted for. No door forced? Holmes asked. None. No window disturbed? No sign of any. And who has access to Sir Julian's private room during normal hours? Harcourt listed them methodically. Sir Julian himself, of course. Harcourt as junior barrister. Mr. Tobias Prentice, the senior clerk, who had served in those chambers for nearly 20 years. Miss Clara Vane, Sir Julian's niece, who acted as his secretary and personal correspondent, and on occasion, visiting solicitors and their representatives whose access was always supervised. Holmes listened without interruption. When Harcourt had finished, Holmes said in the tone of a man testing the weight of an idea, "You have told me what was taken. Tell me now who might have wished Bellamy to remain in prison." The young barrister hesitated. "That is rather more difficult to answer with confidence. Bellamy's writings have given offence in certain quarters. He has written with considerable force against what he calls the manipulation of legal process by men of property and influence. His particular target in his most recent pamphlet was the misuse of inheritance law to dispossess those without the means to contest a settlement." "A broad target," I observed. "Broad, yes. But I suspect it was aimed at someone specific. Bellamy is not a careless man." Holmes nodded slowly. He crossed to the mantelpiece and took his pipe from its bracket. "Mr. Harcourt," he said, "you have described to me a set of chambers populated entirely by persons of excellent reputation. Barristers, clerks, a solicitor, a niece who doubles as secretary, all known quantities, all above suspicion." "Precisely so. Then you begin to see why this case interests me." Holmes lit his pipe and regarded the young barrister through the first thin curl of smoke. "A writ of habeas corpus is not merely a piece of paper, as your colleagues in the police will no doubt treat it. It is a command issued by the law itself, a command that a man be brought before a court and accounted for. It says, in effect, that no authority, however powerful, may cause a person simply to disappear. Whoever removed that writ did not merely steal a document, they silenced a command. and that, Mr. Harcourt, requires not only opportunity, but a very particular kind of motive." The young man stared at him. "You mean they feared what Bellamy might say once he stood before a judge?" Holmes drew upon his pipe and said nothing. But I had seen that look before, and I knew what it meant. The case had taken hold of him. Whatever lay behind the theft of that writ, whatever quiet machinery of deception had been set in motion behind the polished doors of Lincoln's Inn, Holmes would not rest until he had found the mechanism and named its maker. "We shall visit the chambers tomorrow morning," he said at last. "In the meantime, Mr. Harcourt, I should be grateful if you would write down for me, as completely and honestly as you can, the names and particulars of every person who was present in or near those chambers between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock yesterday evening. Leave nothing out, however trivial or however well regarded the individual in question." Harcourt agreed without hesitation. He accepted paper and pen from the writing table and spent some minutes in careful composition before handing the result to Holmes, who folded it without reading it and placed it in his coat pocket. After Harcourt had gone, I found Holmes standing again at the window, the pipe burning steadily, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street below. "Well?" I asked. "A writ stolen from locked chambers by persons unknown, with the apparent purpose of keeping a pamphleteer silent," he said. "The police will look for passion, or politics, or simple opportunism. They will be wrong." "How can you be certain at this stage?" He turned from the window with something approaching a smile. "Because the crime was committed in a room where everyone is respectable, Watson. And in such a room, respectability is always the first thing to suspect." He returned to his violin, and I to my notes, and the grey London afternoon closed around Baker Street without further incident. But I confess I slept less soundly than usual that night, turning over in my mind the image of a man confined in some prison cell while, in the carpeted rooms of Lincoln's Inn, someone read the morning papers with great composure and waited to see whether their design would hold. Chapter 2. The Honourable Circle. Lincoln's Inn, on a November morning, possesses a quality of stillness that one does not readily find elsewhere in London. The great city presses against it on all sides, yet within those ancient courts the sound of traffic is muffled to a murmur, and one walks upon flagstones worn smooth by generations of men who carried the law in their heads and the future of others in their hands. The buildings are severe and dignified, their dark brick softened only by the occasional pale gleam of a window, and the few figures who move beneath the archways do so with the measured pace of those accustomed to proceedings in which haste is considered a form of impropriety. Holmes and I arrived shortly before 10 o'clock the following morning. He had said little at breakfast, and less on the cab ride over, which I had learned to interpret not as indifference but as concentration. He carried his stick but held it loosely, and his eyes moved with that habitual unhurried attention which took in everything and seemed to settle on nothing. Edward Harcourt was waiting for us at the entrance to Sir Julian's chambers. He looked as though he had slept poorly and compensated with excessive application of care in his dress, the result being a young man who appeared simultaneously exhausted and over-prepared. He greeted us with evident relief and led us up a short flight of stairs into a suite of rooms that, had I not known their purpose, I might easily have mistaken for the private library of a country house. The walls were lined with bound volumes, the carpets were dark and well tended, and the air carried that particular smell of old paper and beeswax polish which belongs exclusively to the institutions of English law. Sir Julian Merryweather received us in his private room. He was a man of perhaps 65, tall and spare, with the deliberate manner of one who has spent a lifetime choosing words with surgical care. His face was patrician, deeply lined, and wore at this moment an expression of contained displeasure, the displeasure of a man who has found something disordered in a world he has ordered with great effort. He shook Holmes's hand, acknowledged mine, and directed us to chairs with a gesture that was courteous without being warm. "I am grateful you have come, Mr. Holmes, though I confess the necessity is mortifying," he said. "In 34 years of practice I have not once mislaid a document of consequence. That something of this nature should occur in my chambers is a matter I find deeply troubling." "The document was not mislaid, Sir Julian," Holmes said pleasantly. "It was removed. That is a distinction worth preserving from the outset." Sir Julian received this without visible reaction. "Just so." The other members of what I had begun privately to think of as the household were brought in, not all at once, but in a succession that allowed Holmes, I suspected, to observe each as they entered. Tobias Prentice came first. He was a lean, precise man of 50 or thereabouts, with close-cropped grey hair and the careful hands of someone who had spent decades handling papers he was not permitted to crumple. He sat straight-backed and offered his account of the previous evening with the fluency of a man repeating something he has already rehearsed, not from dishonesty, but from the professional habit of having his facts in order before he opened his mouth. Miss Clara Vane arrived next and made a rather different impression. She was perhaps 30, composed in her bearing in a way that suggested self-possession rather than coldness, with intelligent dark eyes and the quietness of someone who listened more than she spoke. She acknowledged Holmes with a small inclination of her head, and settled in the chair offered to her, with none of the visible agitation that had characterised Harcourt the previous afternoon. I noticed that when Samuel Bellamy's name was mentioned in passing by Sir Julian, her attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. Holmes, I was certain, noticed it too. Colonel Adrian Bellamy arrived last and with the most ceremony. He was a broad, well-made man in his middle 50s, with the colouring of someone who had spent time in warmer climates, and the posture of one who considered good posture a form of personal honour. His manner was polished but not friendly, and he greeted Holmes with the particular reserve of a man who regards the engagement of a private detective as a slightly regrettable necessity, as one might regard sending for a plumber. "My brother's situation is, I need hardly say, an embarrassment," he remarked, settling himself with deliberate ease. "I hope this matter can be resolved without further public attention." "That will depend rather upon the matter itself," Holmes replied, with equal pleasantness, and moved immediately to other questions. I had taken my customary position slightly to one side, notebook open, and I spent the better part of the next hour watching Holmes conduct his examination. His method in such circumstances has always been difficult to describe accurately, because what is most significant about it is precisely what is least visible. He did not press. He did not surprise. He asked, with apparent casualness, about the routine of the chambers, the order in which things were done, who had access to which rooms and upon what occasions, and how the blue brief folder had come to rest upon Sir Julian's desk, rather than in the document box where completed writs were ordinarily stored. The answer to this last question was simply that Sir Julian had intended to carry it himself to the club, and had placed it where he would not forget it. A small deviation from routine. Holmes noted it with a nod and passed to the next topic. 2 visitors had called at the chambers during the afternoon preceding the theft. One was Mr. Silas Kedge, a solicitor of considerable standing whose firm had occasional professional dealings with Sir Julian's chambers, and who had stopped in, apparently without appointment, to discuss a matter of conveyancing. The other was Mr. Vernon Pike, a journalist of some prominence who wrote on legal and political affairs for one of the more serious evening papers, and who had been pursuing Sir Julian for a comment on the Bellamy case for the past several days. Sir Julian had declined to see him. Pike had, according to Prentice, remained in the outer office for some 20 minutes before accepting this refusal and departing. Holmes heard these details with his head slightly to one side, like a musician listening for a note slightly off pitch. He asked where Pike had waited during those 20 minutes. Prentice indicated the outer office, visible through a half-glazed partition from his own desk. Pike had been, Prentice said, attentive and agreeable, and had spoken to one of the copying clerks about the general principles of habeas corpus applications. "Attentive," Holmes repeated, not as a question. "He is a journalist," said Prentice, as though this were sufficient explanation. Holmes said nothing further on that point, but I observed that he made the briefest possible mark in the margin of his notes. What struck me most as the morning progressed was not anything that was said, but rather the quality of what lay beneath the saying. Every person in that room spoke of justice with facility. Sir Julian invoked it in nearly every other sentence. Colonel Bellamy used the word frequently, though always in proximity to the word reputation. Prentice treated it as a procedural category. Miss Vane, alone among them, did not use the word at all, yet she was the only one in whose face I could detect any genuine anxiety for the man at the centre of the matter. Before we left, Holmes asked permission to examine Sir Julian's private room alone for a few minutes. This was granted, and I accompanied him while the others withdrew. He moved about the room with characteristic quietness, touching nothing at first, simply looking. Then he knelt briefly beside the desk, examined the surface of the floor near the passage door and stood again. He lifted the corner of the blotter. He opened the window an inch, then closed it. At the private passage door he paused, leaned slightly forward, and was still for a moment. "Do you smell that?" he said quietly. I leaned in. There was something faint and not quite identifiable beneath the prevailing odour of paper and leather, something I associated in a vague way with the theatre. "Grease paint," I ventured. Holmes straightened. "Or its near relative." He said no more. We took our leave of Sir Julian and his assembled household and descended to the inn's courtyard. The morning had turned colder, and thin wisps of fog were beginning to settle among the buildings. "Well," I said when we were clear of the gate, "what do you make of them?" Holmes walked in silence for a moment. "I make this of them, Watson. They're a group of people united by the language of justice and divided by their reasons for using it. One of them is performing a role they did not originate. Another is concealing a distress they are too proud to name. And at least one person in that room," he said, "knows something they have decided is not their business to tell." He hailed a cab before I could ask which was which. Chapter 3. The Vanishing at the Dinner Hour. There is a particular kind of puzzle which presents itself not as a locked room, nor as a missing person, but as a missing interval of time. A thing exists at one moment and does not exist at the next, and the space between those two moments, though it may be measured in minutes, contains within it all the machinery of the crime. The theft of Sir Julian Merryweather's writ was precisely such a puzzle. Everything before 6 o'clock was accounted for. Everything after 7 was consequence. The hour between was the question, and it was to that hour that Holmes turned his full attention, on the afternoon following our visit to Lincoln's Inn. He had, through Harcourt, arranged for the principal witnesses to provide written accounts of their movements during the critical period. These arrived at Baker Street by messenger shortly after 3 o'clock, and Holmes spread them across the deal table without ceremony and read them in a silence broken only by the occasional soft sound of a page being turned. I had settled with a book on the opposite side of the room, but found my attention drawn increasingly to Holmes rather than to my reading, for there is something in his manner of working through written testimony that communicates itself even at a distance. He reads as a musician reads a score, following not one voice but many simultaneously. "Come here a moment, Watson," he said at last. I joined him at the table. He had arranged the statements in a rough arc, and had set beside them a hand-drawn plan of Sir Julian's chambers, sketched from memory with a precision that would not have shamed a professional surveyor. "The writ was placed in the blue folder at 6 o'clock, Holmes said, tracing the path with one finger. Sir Julian then departed for the Athenaeum Club, where he dined with 3 colleagues. He left the folder on his desk, which is here, because he intended to return for it at 6:45 and proceed directly to meet the court officer. In the event, the dinner extended itself slightly, and he did not return until 7:05. The folder was there. He carried it to the appointed meeting. When it was opened, the writ was gone, and an old pleading substituted in its place. So the substitution occurred between 6 and 7. Between 6 and shortly before 7, yes. Now. Prentice states that he remained at his own desk in the outer office until 6:30, when he locked the document register and proceeded home. He saw no one enter or leave Sir Julian's private room during that time. That seems to narrow the window considerably. It would, if Prentice's account were quite complete. Holmes lifted one of the pages. He states he was at his desk, but he also mentions, almost parenthetically, that he stepped to the correspondence room, which is here, along this passage, to collect the evening's outgoing letters at approximately 10 minutes past 6. He estimates he was absent from his desk for perhaps 5 minutes. I saw it immediately. 5 minutes is quite sufficient. More than sufficient. The passage door to Sir Julian's room, you will recall, opens from inside the private passage and is never locked during working hours, only at close of business. 5 minutes is not merely sufficient, Watson. It is generous. He set the page down. Now, consider the replacement document. He produced a sheet he had obtained from Harcourt, a photographic copy of the old pleading that had been found in the blue folder in the Writ's place. Even to my untrained eye, the handwriting was clearly professional, the kind formed by years of copying legal documents in an era when such things were done by hand. But Holmes indicated a particular passage near the foot of the second page, and I leaned forward to examine it. The letter F, he said. Observe how it is formed in every instance throughout the document. The upper loop closes to the left consistently. It is a habit acquired early and not easily abandoned. But here, in this single instance, he pointed, the upper loop closes to the right. A momentary lapse. A momentary self. Holmes straightened. Whoever produced this document copied Prentice's hand with considerable skill. But under the pressure of sustained imitation, one small formation reverted to its natural form. It is not Prentice's hand. It is someone impersonating it, and impersonating it very well indeed, but not perfectly. I considered this. The forger had access to genuine samples of Prentice's writing. Ample access, I should think, given the nature of the chambers and the volume of copied material that passes through them. He turned next to what he had described to me the previous evening as the matter of the messenger. Harcourt had mentioned, in the course of a supplementary note, that a messenger had called at the chambers at approximately 6:15, bearing a sealed letter for Sir Julian from a solicitor's firm in Gray's Inn. The letter had been received by Prentice before he departed, and placed with the ordinary correspondence. Holmes had sent word to the Gray's Inn firm that morning. Their reply had arrived with the other documents. They had sent no letter. A messenger whose errand did not exist, I said. A messenger who needed to be present in the outer office for a period of time during which Prentice was occupied, Holmes corrected. One who needed, moreover, to be sufficiently plausible and forgettable that Prentice would accept the letter without extended scrutiny and return his attention to his desk. And the accent Harcourt mentioned, country Kentish. That detail came to me this morning through a second note from Harcourt, who had spoken again with the copying clerk, young Simmons, who dealt with the messenger directly while Prentice was occupied. Holmes moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, facing me. Simmons is a Norfolk man. He knows the difference between a Kentish accent and a performed one, and he said, when pressed, that the messenger's voice struck him as slightly inconsistent. Not wrong precisely, but as though the man were thinking about it. I placed all of this carefully in the order Holmes had assembled it. A fabricated errand, a performed accent, a 5-minute absence by the only witness, a substituted document in a forged hand, and beneath the passage door that faint residue of theatrical grease paint. He came in costume, I said. He came in character, Holmes replied, with a precision I recognized as deliberate. There is a distinction. A costume is an assemblage of garments. A character is sustained through voice, manner, timing, and an accurate understanding of what the people around you expect to see. Our man was not merely dressed as a clerk's messenger. He inhabited the role well enough to remain in the outer office for several minutes, receive Prentice's acknowledgement, exchange a few words with Simmons, and depart without leaving an impression sufficiently sharp for either man to describe him precisely. Yet they mentioned the gloves. Yes, Holmes's expression became thoughtful. The gloves are interesting. Simmons noted them because they seemed at odds with the rest of the man's appearance. Too fine for a working messenger, too worn and creased for a gentleman. The sort of gloves, one might say, that a gentleman has owned for some years and has taken some pains to age further. He paused. Or purchased from a theatrical costumer. The coals settled in the grate. Outside, the early dark of November was coming on, and the lamps in the street below were beginning to assert themselves against the dusk. I had been following Holmes's reconstruction with the growing conviction that it excluded almost entirely the red herrings which had apparently satisfied Lestrade's preliminary inquiries. The suggestion of passion between Harcourt and Clara Vane, the implication that Harcourt might have acted from jealousy toward Colonel Bellamy, the vague notion of some political conspiracy rooted in Bellamy's pamphleteering, all of these seemed to Holmes not merely unproven, but structurally improbable, and I said so. "You're right to dismiss them," he said, "though for reasons slightly different from your own. A man acting from passion does not plan. A crime of jealousy does not require a forged document, a fabricated identity, and a theatrical property. Passion produces directness, sometimes catastrophic directness, but not this kind of layered preparation." He settled into his chair and pressed his fingertips together in the familiar fashion. "What we have here is a crime prepared in advance. The substitute document existed before the evening of the theft. The false errand was arranged in advance. The messenger's character was constructed and rehearsed. That is not passion. That is architecture. Then someone knew, well beforehand, that the writ was coming, or ensured that it would come, and prepared accordingly." He reached for his pipe. "There is a difference, Watson, between a crime committed in response to circumstances and a crime that has arranged its circumstances in advance. We are dealing with the latter." I said nothing for a time. The fire crackled and the room settled into the particular comfort of an investigation properly joined. That sensation I had known many times in that sitting room, of standing at the edge of a thing not yet visible but already, one felt, within reach of the right kind of attention. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, without looking up, "I intend to find out where a man might hire a clerk's coat, a mild Kentish accent, and a pair of carefully aged black gloves. Chapter 4, A Clerk's Hand and a Soldier's Temper." Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following morning without invitation, which was his custom, and with the expression of a man who has formed a satisfactory conclusion and wishes to share it before anyone can complicate it, which was also his custom. He was shown up by Mrs. Hudson at 9:30, accepted a cup of tea with a nod of professional gratitude, and settled himself in the basket chair with the particular air of one who believes he's about to be congratulated. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I think we have our man." Holmes was at the table, examining through his lens a page of handwriting that Harcourt had procured for him from the Chamber's document register. He did not look up. "Do you?" he said. "Harcourt, the junior barrister." Lestrade set down his cup with a small, decisive sound. Had access to the desk, had motive to embarrass the Colonel, and was seen by the copying clerk Simmons in the vicinity of Sir Julian's door at approximately 6:20, which places him there neatly inside our window. "Simmons said he was in the vicinity of the door," Holmes repeated. "In the corridor leading to it, which amounts to the same thing." "It amounts to being in a corridor, Lestrade, which is a somewhat more commonplace location." The inspector's expression adjusted itself from satisfaction to the tolerant forbearance he habitually adopted when Holmes expressed reservations about his conclusions. "The motive is solid enough," he said. "Harcourt has an interest in Miss Vane. The Colonel has made his opposition to that interest plain, and keeping Samuel Bellamy in prison is as much a blow against Harcourt as anything else, given that Harcourt was the one pressing most loudly for the writ to be issued in the first place. He could have taken it simply to embarrass the Colonel and create a public scene." I looked up from my own notes. By stealing a document that would have helped a man he was himself championing? That seems rather to work against his own interests, Inspector. Lestrade considered this with the expression of a man who finds an inconvenient point less persuasive than it deserves to be. "Passion is not always logical, Doctor." "No," said Holmes, finally setting down his lens. "But this crime is. that is rather the point. He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, turning the handwriting page absently in his fingers. "What do you know of Harcourt's history with documents, Lestrade? Has he any background in copying or clerical work? Not that I have found. And the substitute pleading found in the folder, have your people examined it closely? It appears to be in Prentice's hand." "It appears to be," Holmes agreed with an emphasis that Lestrade either did not notice or chose to disregard. Holmes held the page he had been studying toward the light from the window. It was, I knew, a sample of Tobias Prentice's genuine hand, taken from a routine letter in the Chamber's register. "Prentice has written for 40 years in legal offices," Holmes said. 40 years produces habits of formation so deeply embedded that they survive illness, distraction, and advancing age. This letter here, a capital R, is constructed in 3 strokes, in a particular sequence that produces a very slightly heavier second downstroke. It is consistent across every example I have been given. In the substitute pleading, the R is constructed in 2 strokes. The visual resemblance is very close. The underlying habit is entirely different. Lestrade put on the expression reserved for what he considered an excess of technicality. Handwriting can vary. Handwriting varies in weight, in slant, in spacing. It does not vary in stroke sequence. The muscle learns the sequence before the hand learns the letter. Our forger studied Prentice's completed forms and reproduced the appearance admirably. He could not reproduce the making of it, because he was not present when the hand was formed. Holmes set the page down. "Harcourt, as you yourself observed, has no history of clerical or copying work. The substitute document was produced by someone who does." Lestrade departed shortly afterward, not quite persuaded, but sufficiently uncertain to be going about other inquiries before returning to his preferred conclusion. Holmes watched the cab carry him away from the window and said, without particular censure, "He is not entirely wrong to look at the people closest to the desk. He is merely looking at them for the wrong reasons." We spent the remainder of that morning in a rather different direction. Holmes had, through inquiries made the previous afternoon, established that Colonel Adrian Bellamy was staying at his club in Pall Mall, and had that morning engaged a solicitor to commence certain proceedings against his brother's estate. The information reached us through Harcourt, who had it from Miss Vane, and who had communicated it in a note of barely suppressed fury. "The Colonel moves quickly," I observed. "The Colonel has been waiting," said Holmes. He took his coat from the hook. "Come, Watson, I think a brief conversation with Colonel Bellamy is overdue." The club in Pall Mall received us with the cool civility extended to visitors who are not members. Colonel Bellamy met us in a small anteroom off the main hall, and he did so, I noticed, with his shoulders set and his chin slightly elevated, the posture of a man prepared for territory that he intends to defend. He was not, I must record, discourteous. He was something more difficult to deal with than discourtesy. He was correct, measured, and entirely closed. He expressed regret at the situation in his chamber's general terms, offered no speculation as to the perpetrator, and expressed confidence that the legal system would resolve itself appropriately. When Holmes asked him directly about his brother, the composition did not quite fracture, but something shifted behind the eyes. "Samuel made his choices," the Colonel said. "He chose to involve himself in political agitation, to publish materials designed to embarrass certain parties, and to do so under circumstances that drew consequences upon himself. I cannot pretend to regard his present situation with the distress that Mr. Harcourt and others appear to expect of me." "And the proceedings against his estate," Holmes said, with the mild curiosity of a man raising a point of no particular urgency. "You initiated those before the writ was taken, or very shortly afterward." A pause, brief, but there. "I initiated them when it became clear that Samuel's affairs were in a condition requiring management." "Quite. And if the writ had been presented and Samuel had appeared before a judge and been released, those proceedings would have become considerably more complicated, I imagine. A man at liberty is rather better placed to contest a legal action than a man in a cell." The Colonel's expression did not change. I am not responsible for the theft of a legal document, Mr. Holmes. I have not suggested that you are, Holmes replied pleasantly and rose. He thanked the Colonel for his time with impeccable courtesy, and said nothing further until we were on the pavement outside. He is concealing something, I said. He is concealing several things. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind him, a posture I associated with organised thought. But I do not believe the Colonel stole the writ. He lacks the technical knowledge to produce the substitute document, and more importantly, he lacks the patience for that quality of sustained preparation. The Colonel is a man accustomed to direct action. If he wished to obstruct his brother, he would do so through legal channels of his own, not through theatrical impersonation in illegal chambers. Yet he benefits from the obstruction. Many people benefit from a crime without committing it. That is one of the more inconvenient features of complex cases. Holmes paused at the corner. The Colonel knows something about his brother's history, something connected to the inheritance matter that Samuel's pamphleteering has been circling. He knows it, and he considers it, on balance, best left undisturbed. Whether he knows who disturbed the writ to preserve that silence is a separate question, and one I am not yet ready to answer. 3 languages, he'd said at the chambers on our first visit: speech, handwriting, and costume. One of them was lying, perhaps all 3. Walking back toward the embankment in the thin November light, I found myself turning that formulation over and beginning, very slowly, to understand what he had meant. Chapter 5. Tears that do not arrive on cue. Holmes conducted his private interviews on the 3rd day of the inquiry, and he conducted them characteristically, in a sequence that appeared to follow no particular logic until one understood that the logic was his own. He began not with the most obvious suspect, nor with the most reticent, but with the one he considered most likely to speak the truth without intending to. I was present throughout, seated a little apart with my notebook, though on more than one occasion I found the notebook resting idle in my lap while I simply listened. Miss Clara Vane came first. Holmes had requested, through Harcourt, that she meet us in a small anteroom adjacent to the main chambers, a room used for consultations with junior clients and furnished with the spare respectability of a place in which difficult things are sometimes said. She arrived precisely on time, which I noted as a kind of statement in itself, and sat with her hands folded in her lap and her attention directed at Holmes with an openness that was entirely without performance. Holmes opened without preamble. "Miss Vane, I should like to speak about Samuel Bellamy, not about the writ, and not about the theft, but about the man himself. What can you tell me of him?" She was quiet for a moment. Not hesitant, I thought, but choosing. "He is thoughtful," she said at last. "More thoughtful than his writings might suggest if you have read only the polemical pieces. He is also, I believe, genuinely frightened, though he would not say so. He has never been a man who admitted fear easily. You know him well." "I have known him for some years. He worked for a period in a legal copying firm, before his writing became sufficient to support him. We met through professional circumstances." She paused. "He worked then under a different name, not from any wish to deceive, but because the name Bellamy was already a complication in certain quarters." Holmes allowed a moment to pass without filling it, which was itself a kind of question. Miss Vane answered it. He had discovered certain irregularities in records connected to his family's inheritance settlement, documents which appeared to have been altered. He was proceeding carefully, gathering what he could before he acted. It was that process, I believe, which eventually led to his pamphleteering, which was in part a way of creating a public record of what he knew before anyone could prevent him from speaking. "And someone has now prevented him from speaking," Holmes said. "Yes." The word was very quiet. "I have been afraid of this for some time." I watched her as she said this. There was nothing theatrical in her manner, no gathering of visible emotion, no studied pause. She was describing fear the way one describes a weather condition that has lasted too long, plainly, because it was simply the truth of the thing. It struck me, not for the first time, that she was rather more formidable than the role of niece and secretary had led any of us to initially assume. Holmes asked her several more questions about the nature of the inheritance irregularities as Bellamy had described them to her, about the names connected to the old settlement, and about whether Bellamy had spoken of anyone in particular whom he suspected of the original fraud. She answered as fully as she was able, which was more fully than I had expected. When Holmes thanked her and she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "he's a good man, not a perfect one, but a good one. I should not like him to remain where he is one day longer than is necessary." "He will not," said Holmes. It was not a reassurance. It was simply a statement of intention, and she received it as such, and left. Edward Harcourt came next, and the difference in atmosphere was immediate and considerable. Where Miss Vane had been still, Harcourt was in motion almost before he sat down, shifting his weight, moving his hands, beginning sentences and redirecting them. His feeling for Clara Vane was written in everything about him, in the slight heightening of colour when her name was mentioned, in the way his jaw set when Colonel Bellamy's was. Holmes observed all of this with the expression of a doctor taking a pulse, interested and impersonal. "You argued with Colonel Bellamy," Holmes said, 2 days before the theft. He had said something intolerable about Samuel, about how the family would be better served by Samuel's remaining where he was until certain matters were settled. Harcourt's voice was controlled but effortful. I told him plainly what I thought of that position. Where did this exchange occur? In the outer office of these chambers. I am afraid it was not entirely quiet. Who was present? Harcourt considered. Prentice was at his desk. Miss Vane was in the correspondence room. I am not certain whether the door was closed. Holmes asked nothing further about the quarrel. Instead, he moved directly to a series of precise technical questions about the chamber's routine that seemed to take Harcourt somewhat by surprise. Questions about when the document boxes were locked, who held duplicate keys, whether visiting solicitors ever passed unsupervised through the inner passage. Harcourt answered these conscientiously, if without the systematic precision that Prentice had brought to the same ground. When the interview was finished and Harcourt had gone, Holmes sat for a moment without speaking. "He is transparent," he said finally. "Every feeling he possesses is immediately visible. A man of that constitution cannot sustain a deception requiring preparation over weeks and the suppression of his own nature throughout. He is quite incapable of this crime. And the quarrel with the Colonel is exactly what it appears to be. A young man in love defending the brother of the woman he loves against a man who is being deliberately obstructive. Nothing more. Vernon Pike arrived late, which I suspected was a professional habit rather than discourtesy. He was a compact, energetic man in his early 40s, with quick eyes and the manner of someone perpetually assembling material, a journalist's manner, present in everything while belonging entirely to nothing. He had about him a quality of performance, not dishonesty precisely, but the trained responsiveness of a man who has spent years adjusting his presentation to his audience. He shook Holmes's hand with a firmness slightly in excess of the occasion, and sat down as though the chair were a stage position he had already rehearsed. He gave a vivid and detailed account of having observed, from the street below, a figure leaving the premises of Lincoln's Inn at approximately 25 minutes past 6 on the evening in question. A man in a dark coat, he said, moving with purposeful haste. Middling height, he thought. Something particular about the way he held his left shoulder slightly raised. He had thought little of it at the time, but in retrospect, given what had occurred, it seemed significant. Holmes listened to all of this with courteous attention. Then he said, "You described his coat and his shoulder before you described his face. Can you give me anything of his face?" Pike paused. The light was not ideal. "Of course. His coat, then. What colour?" "Dark. Navy, possibly, or charcoal." "And his hat?" "A round hat. A bowler, I believe." "The shoulder? You said the left was raised. Was this a habitual posture, would you say? or the posture of a man carrying something. Another pause, longer than the first. I could not say with certainty. Holmes nodded pleasantly. One more thing. You were standing in the street. On which side of the gate? Pike answered, and Holmes thanked him and brought the interview to a close. When the journalist had gone, Holmes turned to me with an expression I knew well, the mild, almost amused look that preceded a sharp observation. He described the coat before the face, Holmes said, and the shoulder before the hat, and the hat before any feature of the man himself. When pressed on the face, he retreated to the light. A genuine witness remembers faces imperfectly and peripheral details hardly at all. An invented witness has constructed his scene visually, as a composition, and describes it from the outside inward. He rose and moved to the window. Pike did not see that man. He imagined him. The question is why he imagined him at that moment, at that precise location, in such specific and yet ultimately uncorroborated detail, I said slowly. He wanted us to believe someone had been seen leaving. He wanted us to believe there was a stranger, someone from outside the honourable circle. Holmes looked out at the courtyard, which tells us something important, Watson. It tells us that Vernon Pike knows there was no stranger, and knowing that, he invented one. He was quiet for a moment and then, speech, handwriting, costume. I said one of them was lying. It may be that all three are, but they are not all lying in the same direction. Chapter 6. The Man Who Was Two Men. There are investigations which proceed by accumulation, each new fact adding its weight to a growing body of evidence until the conclusion becomes inevitable by sheer mass. And there are others which turn upon a single thread, thin and easily missed, that once pulled causes the entire arrangement to shift. The inquiry into the stolen writ had, by its fourth day, the character of the second kind. Holmes knew it, I suspected, before he said anything of the sort, and the quality of his silence over breakfast on Thursday morning, a focused, directed silence quite different from the abstracted moodiness that had preceded our involvement, confirmed it. He said, setting down his coffee cup with a small decisive sound, "I am going to find James Tolliver today. You know where to look. I know what to look for, which is rather more useful." He was already reaching for his coat. "Come." He gave the cab driver an address in Maiden Lane, which surprised me, for that narrow street behind the Strand is known principally for its restaurants and the theatre-adjacent trades that cluster around Covent Garden. But as we turned into it and Holmes indicated a narrow shop front between a print seller and a glover, I understood at once. The sign above the door read, in faded gilt letters, Hargreave and Son, Theatrical Costumiers and Perruquiers, established 1847. The interior was a place of remarkable density. Coats of every description hung in ranked rows from ceiling-mounted rails, interspersed with military tunics, clerical vestments, legal gowns, and several garments whose period and purpose I could not immediately identify. Hats occupied shelves along two walls. A smell compounded of camphor, old fabric, and something sweetly chemical pervaded everything. Behind a low counter, a small sharp-eyed man of 60-odd regarded us with the professional wariness of someone accustomed to inquiries not entirely straightforward. Holmes introduced himself without elaboration. He placed on the counter a brief written description, which he had composed, I noticed, in the cab, and which covered the items he had inferred from the evidence. A plain dark clerk's coat in keeping with legal chambers, worn black gloves showing signs of deliberate aging, a wig or false side whiskers of a forgettable brown, and materials suitable for producing the faint but distinctive odour of theatrical grease paint in a confined space. The proprietor, whose name was Hargreave the Younger, read this with the expression of a man recognising something he had been half expecting. 3 weeks ago, he said without being asked. Perhaps a little more, a gentleman. I say gentleman because of his hands and his speech, though the rest of him was quite plain. He returned the paper. He gave the name Forsyth, paid in coin, which is not unusual. He was specific about the gloves, wanted them to look as though they had been worn to work every day for 2 or 3 years. I keep a stock of such things. Items returned by productions, that sort of thing." Hargreave paused. He also purchased a small quantity of spirit gum and a preparation we use for aging paper, darkening the edges, giving it the look of something that has sat in a file for years. "The preparation for aging paper," Holmes said. "Would that also produce a residual odour, in a room where it had been recently used?" Hargreave considered. If the preparation had been applied on the premises, or if materials treated with it had been handled there, yes. It is oil-based, and the scent persists longer than one might expect. Holmes thanked him, obtained a brief written description of the man who had called himself Forsyth, and we were back in Maiden Lane within a quarter of an hour. He stood on the pavement for a moment with the description in his hand, reading it a second time with the absorption of a scholar verifying a translation. "Middling height," I read over his shoulder, "spare frame, dark hair, little grey, clean-shaven, a slight deliberateness of manner, as though choosing each word before speaking it. And his hands," Holmes said. Hargreave mentioned his hands before anything else. Large, steady, with a particular smoothness that comes not from idleness, but from work of a precise and careful kind. He folded the paper and placed it in his breast pocket. "Not a clerk's hands, Watson, a solicitor's." He said it quietly, as one confirms rather than announces something, and then hailed a cab for the British Museum reading room, where he spent the better part of the afternoon in the company of legal directories, trade registers, and at least one volume I could not identify from my position at the adjacent table. I occupied myself with a monograph on the wound histories of the Afghan campaign, and tried to ignore the growing conviction that Holmes was approaching something significant. At 3:30 he closed the last volume and sat back with his elbows on the reading table, and his fingers pressed flat against its surface, a posture I had never seen him adopt before, and which suggested, for some reason I could not articulate, that he was steadying himself against a conclusion. "Silas Kedge," he said, at a volume calculated precisely to reach my ears and no further, "was admitted as a solicitor in 1871. He practised for 5 years in a firm called Pendleton and Marsh, which handled, among other things, the estates of several families of moderate property in the Kent and Surrey border country. He left that firm in 1876 under circumstances not recorded in any directory. In 1877 he established his own practice, and has maintained it since with, as everyone we have spoken to has agreed, an impeccable reputation. And before 1876, that is precisely the interval that interests me." Holmes rose, gathered his notes, and replaced the volumes with the methodical care the reading room required. "The Bellamy family inheritance settlement was concluded in 1875. The managing clerk of Pendleton and Marsh in that year was a man named in the firm's records as Gerald Stanton." He paused. "There is no Gerald Stanton in any legal directory before or after that date. No record of his training, his qualification, or his subsequent employment. He appears for 1 year, executes several significant pieces of work, including the Bellamy settlement, and vanishes." I held this thought carefully for a moment. "You believe Stanton and Kedge are the same man?" "I believe Gerald Stanton was a constructed identity, and that Silas Kedge constructed it, used it, and then retired it when its purpose was served." We moved toward the exit, our footsteps quiet on the stone floor. Consider what that means. A solicitor creates a false clerk, uses that false clerk to manage a settlement he wishes to influence without his own name appearing, then discards the identity and rebuilds his career elsewhere. It is a kind of laundering, not of money, but of an action. The late afternoon outside was cold and beginning to darken, the sky above Great Russell Street the colour of pale slate. I turned up my collar and thought about what Holmes had said. A man who had once built a false identity for professional purposes, who had lived for years under a reputation constructed to conceal what lay beneath it, and who now found himself threatened with exposure by the very man that old fraud had dispossessed. "Bellamy discovered what Stanton had done," I said. "Bellamy discovered what Kedge had done," Holmes corrected gently. While working as a legal copyist under his own assumed name, he was in the records. He knew what to look for because it was his own family's settlement he was searching, and he found an anomaly that no one else had thought to question, because Kedge's reputation made questioning him seem faintly absurd. I thought of the pamphlets on inheritance law, their pointed specificity, their sense of a man who knew precisely what he was describing because he had seen the wound from inside. He was building a public record, I said, as Miss Vane had told us, before anyone could stop him. Someone stopped him nonetheless. Holmes raised his stick for a cab. Which means that Kedge, finding himself threatened with the exposure of an identity he had buried for nearly 20 years, did what he had always done. He built another one. James Tolliver, the mild, forgettable, country-accented messenger, existed nowhere before 3 months ago. Holmes had already established that much. Now I understood why. Tolliver was not a person. He was a tool, fashioned with the same quiet expertise that had once fashioned Gerald Stanton, by a man for whom the construction of plausible identities was less a crime than a professional reflex. "Tomorrow," Holmes said as the cab drew up, "we shall need to find the room where Tolliver slept." Chapter 7. The Discovery in the Journalist's Room. It is one of the more instructive features of criminal investigation that the moment which appears to resolve everything is sometimes the moment at which everything becomes most uncertain. I had observed this phenomenon sufficiently often in Holmes's company to have developed a cautious instinct toward apparent resolutions, and yet when the news arrived on Friday morning I confess that even I felt, for a short time, the particular relief of a case drawing to its close. The message came from Lestrade, and it arrived before 8 o'clock, which indicated that whatever had occurred had done so either very late the previous evening or very early that morning. Holmes read it at the breakfast table, replaced it beside his cup with no outward expression, and resumed buttering his toast. "Well?" I asked. "The writ has been found." I set down my own cup. "Where?" "Vernon Pike's lodgings in Adelphi Terrace, behind a framed engraving of the Strand. Lestrade has arrested him." He ate his toast. I watched him eat it with the attention of a man trying to determine whether a familiar tune is being played correctly or slightly off-key. There was nothing wrong, precisely, in his manner. But there was a quality of deliberate stillness in it that I had learned, over many years, to treat with respect. "You are not satisfied," I said. "I am rarely satisfied before I have examined the thing itself." He rose and reached for his coat. "Let us go and look at Pike's room before Lestrade has rearranged it in the interest of narrative tidiness." Pike had lodged in a first-floor set of rooms in a respectable terrace overlooking the embankment. The landlady, a capable woman named Mrs. Fenwick, admitted us with the slightly dazed compliance of someone still absorbing the morning's events, and led us to the room in question, where a constable stood at the door with the expression of a man carrying out instructions he's not been encouraged to question. Holmes produced the card that Lestrade had included with his note, and we were admitted. The room was the room of a working journalist. Books in no particular order, papers in several overlapping arrangements, 2 or 3 different editions of morning papers folded to the pages that interested him, an inkstand of the heavy brass variety that suggested professional use rather than occasional correspondence, and a desk of the kind designed for sustained occupation. The framing print, a handsome engraving of the old Strand before recent improvements, hung at a slight angle on the wall opposite the window, and beside it, where Lestrade's men had opened it, a shallow space behind the plasterwork had been roughly converted into a concealed recess by means of a small hinged panel cut into the wainscot. The writ was gone, of course, taken as evidence, but Holmes did not look at the space where it had been found. He looked at the print beside it. He examined the hanging wire first, then the frame, then the plaster around the hinged panel. He placed 2 fingers against the panel itself, pressed gently, and withdrew them. He took out his lens and examined the edge of the panel where it met the wainscot, moving along it slowly, left to right. He straightened, looked at the mantelpiece across the room, and crossed to examine it without explanation. He opened a small lacquered box on the mantel shelf, looked inside it, and closed it again. He went to the writing desk and spent some minutes examining its surface without touching anything on it. I stood in the doorway and observed all of this with the resigned patience of a man who has learned that questions asked during this phase of Holmes's examination produce responses of magnificent inadequacy. Eventually he turned and looked at me, and his expression was the one I'd seen in the reading room the day before, that of a man confirming rather than discovering. "What do you see?" he asked. I looked about the room with genuine attention. A journalist's working room, slightly disordered in the way of someone whose mind moves faster than his filing system. Yes. And the hiding place? I considered the recess in the wainscot. Neatly done. The panel is clean-edged. The hinge is tight. Someone took some care with it. Someone took a great deal of care with it. Holmes moved back to the panel and indicated the edge where it met the wall. The cut is even and clean, made with a good blade and a steady hand. The hinge is recessed so that it shows no gap when closed. This work did not take an evening. It took several hours at minimum, and required tools not commonly found in a journalist's rooms. He paused. Mrs. Fenwick told the constable that Pike has lodged here for 2 years. If he built this recess himself, the sawdust and plaster dust from the cutting would have been almost impossible to fully remove. I can find no trace of either. I saw it then. The recess was already here, or was created very recently by someone who made it their business to have access to this room. He moved to the window and looked down at the terrace. Pike has a habit of spending his Friday mornings at the offices of his newspaper, a habit documented in his own published diary pieces with the cheerful indiscretion of a man who considers his routine an advertisement for his industry. Anyone who reads his work knows where he will be on a Friday morning, and therefore knows that a Friday morning is the time to search his rooms without him in them. I leaned against the door frame and thought about this with care. You're suggesting the writ was placed here deliberately by someone other than Pike. I am suggesting that the method of concealment is inconsistent with the character of the man who is supposed to have used it. Pike is demonstrative, quick, impatient with detail. He hides nothing in his prose, and I doubt very much he hides things in his walls. A man of his temperament who had stolen a legal document would not spend 2 evenings building a fitted panel behind a framing print. He would, far more probably, burn the thing. He crossed to the desk and indicated its surface. Moreover, look here. These ink traces on the blotting paper are at least a week old. The desk has not been used in recent days. A man in the grip of a compelling theft and its concealment does not stop writing. Pike writes as other men breathe, I said slowly. And the writ itself. You have not seen it. Not yet. But Harcourt has, briefly, before Lestrade took it into custody. Holmes produced a note from his pocket. He sent this an hour after Lestrade's message. He writes that the document appears in all respects correct, but that the seal impressions seem to him somehow flat, as though applied with a replica rather than the original matrix. I read the note. Harcourt's handwriting conveyed agitation through its slight unevenness, the hand of a man writing faster than was entirely comfortable. He is not certain. He is a junior barrister, not a specialist in seal impressions, but his instinct is sound, and it agrees with mine. Holmes folded the note and returned it to his pocket. The hiding place is theatrical. The timing is theatrical. The selection of Pike as the victim is theatrical, because Pike is himself a public figure whose arrest would generate exactly the sort of noise that distracts a police inquiry at its most sensitive moment. He turned from the window. Watson, everything about this discovery has been arranged to be found. The question is not whether Vernon Pike took the writ. He did not. The question is who needed us to believe he did, and why they needed us to believe it at this precise moment in the inquiry. We descended to the street, where a thin rain had begun to streak the embankment grey. Holmes walked with his hands behind his back, and I kept pace beside him, and for a time neither of us spoke. The river was flat and dark beneath its bridges, and a barge moved downstream with a slow inevitability that seemed, in that moment, to resemble the case itself, something heavy being moved through murky water toward a destination not yet visible from the bank. "He knows we're closing the circle," I said at last. "He has known for a day or two, I think. There are only so many lines of inquiry available to us, and a man of his intelligence will have traced them." Holmes raised his face briefly toward the wet sky. "He built a false messenger to commit the theft. He built a false witness account to confuse the trail. He has now built a false culprit to stop the inquiry entirely. Each construction is a little faster than the last and a little less careful." He glanced at me sidelong. "That is interesting, Watson. A man who makes 3 constructions in swift succession is a man who is running short of time." Chapter 8. Holmes follows the error. Vernon Pike was released from custody on Saturday morning, after Holmes spent the better part of Friday afternoon with Lestrade, laying out in measured terms the physical and logical case against the planted evidence. Lestrade did not capitulate easily. He's not a man who abandons a conclusion without resistance, and there is, I have always thought, a kind of professional honesty in that resistance, a refusal to be simply overridden that distinguishes him from the more pliable sort of official mind. But the evidence of the panel's craftsmanship, the timing of Pike's habitual absence, and above all the problem of the seal impression, which Holmes had by then had an opportunity to examine directly, were together sufficient to move him. The copied writ, when Holmes finally held it, yielded its secret in under 3 minutes. He examined it at the table in Lestrade's office, with the gas turned up and his lens moving slowly across the lower section of the document where the seal impression sat. I stood at his shoulder and tried to see what he was seeing. The impression appeared to me entirely convincing, the familiar matrix of a court seal rendered clearly in red wax, applied with the kind of authority that suggested long practice. "There," Holmes said, touching the edge of the impression with the tip of one finger. "The outer ring. In a genuine seal, the pressure applied to the matrix forces the wax slightly outward at the circumference, creating a small raised lip. This one has been impressed from a cast rather than the original, and the cast does not quite replicate the edge behaviour of the original matrix. The lip is present but uniform, which is to say, it has been modelled rather than formed." Lestrade leaned in. "I'll grant you it's a good copy." "It is an excellent copy. Made, I would estimate, by someone with access to at least one genuine document bearing the original seal, and with sufficient skill in the preparation of casting materials to reproduce the face accurately. What they could not reproduce was the physical behaviour of hot wax under pressure from a centuries-old matrix, which has its own irregularities built into it by time and wear." Holmes straightened. "The real writ exists. This is not it." Pike, once released, proved less dramatically martyred than Holmes had suggested he might be. He arrived at Baker Street that same Saturday evening, accepted whisky, and told us with considerable candour that he had spent his hours in custody, drafting, mentally, 3 separate articles about the experience, a fact which seemed to amuse Holmes and which confirmed, if confirmation were needed, his assessment of the man's fundamental character. Holmes asked him one question that had not been asked before. Had he received, in the days preceding the discovery of the false writ, any communication that seemed unusual or out of the ordinary, anything that might have taken him to a particular location, or occupied his attention at a particular time? Pike considered this with genuine seriousness. "There was a letter," he said after a moment, 3 days ago, from a name I didn't recognise, claiming to be a clerk connected to the Bellamy case, offering to share certain documents privately. I was to meet him in a coffee house in the Strand on Thursday evening." He paused. "He did not appear." "Of course he did not," Holmes said quietly. "The letter was designed to place you out of your rooms for an evening, not to produce a meeting." After Pike had gone, Holmes sat for a long while without speaking, his pipe drawing slowly, his eyes on the ceiling in the attitude that indicated concentrated assembly rather than passive reflection. I had learned not to intrude upon this particular silence, and occupied myself with writing up the week's events in my notebook, finding the process of recording useful in itself, because it forced a sequential order upon materials that Holmes habitually considered in several directions at once. When he finally spoke, it was without preamble, as though continuing a conversation that had been proceeding internally for some time. The forged writ contains one phrase that has been troubling me since I first examined it, he said. In the operative clause, where the legal formula requires the current standard wording, the copyist has used an older formulation. The phrase habeas corpus ad subjiciendum is preceded by a qualifier that was standard before the procedural reforms of 1868, but has not appeared in correct legal usage since. He turned his head toward me. I looked it up at Lincoln's Inn Library yesterday morning while you were speaking with Harcourt. And the significance? The significance is that a clerk trained after 1868 would not use that phrase. It has been out of practice for nearly 30 years. A young man copying legal forms today would simply not know it. But a man trained before the reform, in an office where the old forms were still in daily use, might reproduce it from habit without even noticing the error. I followed this to its destination. Kedge was admitted in 1871, but if he trained before that, if he was already a working clerk in the 1860s under whatever name he then used, he would have spent years writing that qualifier without thinking about it, and when he sat down to produce a false writ, the qualifier came out of the same deep habit that produces a particular letter formation under pressure. Holmes tapped the arm of his chair. The forger and the composer of that substitute pleading are the same person. Both documents contain the residue of a legal education conducted before a procedural reform that most practitioners have long since ceased to think about. On Sunday morning, Holmes called upon Silas Kedge. He did not take me on that visit, which was unusual, and which I remarked upon when he returned. He said without elaboration that he had preferred on this occasion to go alone, and that the conversation had been instructive. I asked in what respect. I gave Mr. Kedge an opportunity to display his ignorance, Holmes said, removing his coat with the unhurried calm of a man who has accomplished something that required some care. I spoke to him in Watson's role rather than my own, that is to say, as a man who knows a little about the law but not enough to be fully confident. I made a small error in the terminology of court procedure, the kind of error a layman might make and a solicitor would naturally correct. And did he correct it? Instantly. Without hesitation, and before he had finished his next sentence. Holmes sat down. He caught a casual error in the conversation of a comparative stranger before he had consciously decided whether correcting it served his interests. That is the reflex of a man whose legal knowledge is entirely automatic. It is not the behaviour of a man who learned the law at one remove, as a spectator. It is the behaviour of a man for whom the law is a second language so thoroughly absorbed that it operates below the threshold of deliberate thought, as it would for someone trained from very early in a legal office, as it would for Gerald Stanton, who spent his formative years in the chambers of Pendleton and Marsh handling documents that predated the procedural reforms. He paused. And then one further thing. As I was leaving, I mentioned, quite casually, the county of Kent. Not in any particular context, simply as part of a sentence about the weather and the approaching winter. Kedge replied, without looking up from his desk. He said that Kent could be bitter at this time of year, that he had not been there in many years, and that one forgot how flat the eastern reaches were. I waited. James Tolliver, Holmes said, spoke with a mild Kentish accent. Kedge, in a moment of entirely unguarded association, has told me that he knows the eastern reaches of Kent, and that he has not been there in many years, which is the kind of remark that a man makes about a place he once knew well, and has since deliberately avoided. He looked at me steadily. The accent was not performed from ignorance of the county, it was performed from knowledge of it, and under the brief pressure of a word unexpected in context, the association surfaced before he could prevent it. I sat back. The week's accumulation of evidence, the forged handwriting, the theatrical costumier, the archival ghost of Gerald Stanton, the planted writ, the outdated legal formula, and now this, assembled itself with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in, each wave smaller than it seemed until one looked back and saw how far the water had advanced. "He cannot know how close you are," I said. "I think he suspects." Holmes picked up his pipe. "Which is why we shall not give him the weekend to consider his position. Tomorrow I shall ask Lestrade to be present in Sir Julian's chambers. There are some explanations that benefit from a larger audience." Chapter 9. The Name Beneath the Name. Monday came in cold and clear, with a frost on the Baker Street pavement that had not quite yielded by 9 o'clock, and a quality of winter light that made the city look simultaneously sharper and more remote than usual. Holmes had been up since before 6. I knew this because the coffee pot, when I came down, was already cold from a first making, and because 2 sheets of closely written notes lay on the deal table beside the remains of a breakfast he had apparently eaten standing. He himself was dressed and at the window when I appeared, watching the street below with the particular attention he gave to things that were about to require action. Lestrade arrived at 10:15, accompanied by a younger constable whose name I did not catch. He had received Holmes's message the previous evening, and had, to his credit, come without demanding a full explanation in advance, which suggested that the week's accumulated evidence had done more work on his official scepticism than he would readily have admitted. "You're satisfied it's Kedge," he said, accepting no refreshment, already prepared to be in motion. "I am satisfied it is Kedge," Holmes replied, without the qualification he might have offered at an earlier stage of the inquiry. "I am also satisfied that the original writ is in his possession, concealed under a client's name in a deed box held at his offices or at his bank. We shall establish which before the morning is out." "On what grounds do I act?" "On the grounds that the document found in Pike's room is a copy, not the original, which your own seal examiner will confirm if he has not done so already. On the grounds that Pike received a fabricated letter designed to remove him from his lodgings. On the grounds that the false writ contains a legal archaism placing its author's training before 1868. And on the grounds," he said, taking his coat from the hook with a single practised movement, "that the man who has spent 20 years living under a constructed reputation is about to discover that constructed reputations have a limited life expectancy." Sir Julian Merryweather's chambers received us with the slightly strained courtesy of a place where something significant is understood to be pending, but where professional form is maintained regardless. Prentice showed us in with his usual precise manner, though I noticed that his eyes moved quickly from Holmes to Lestrade and back again, and that he closed the door behind us with rather more care than was strictly necessary. The room held, when we entered, Sir Julian himself, seated behind his desk with the composed gravity of a presiding judge. Edward Harcourt stood near the window, and Miss Clara Vane was seated slightly to one side, her hands in her lap, her expression one of contained anticipation. Colonel Bellamy had arrived before us and occupied a chair near the fireplace, with the rigid posture of a man determined to maintain his dignity, regardless of what the next hour produced. And Silas Kedge sat in the remaining chair, precisely placed between the desk and the door, with the appearance of a man attending a professional consultation of no particular urgency. He was neatly dressed, clean-shaven, and quite still. His hands, which Hargreave the costumier had described as large and steady, rested on his knees without movement. He looked at Holmes when we entered with the mild, considering gaze of a man who has been expecting this visit and has decided in advance upon the precise expression he intends to wear during it. Holmes did not address him immediately. He placed his hat on the table, glanced at Lestrade to confirm the constable was positioned near the door, and turned first to Sir Julian. "I am grateful to you all for coming," he said, in the easy tone of a man beginning a conversation, rather than concluding an investigation. "I will be as direct as the circumstances permit. The writ of habeas corpus for Samuel Bellamy was stolen by a single individual, who prepared for the theft over a period of several weeks, who created a false identity to carry out the physical act of removal, who produced both the substitute document and the forged copy of the writ discovered in Mr. Pike's lodgings, and who arranged for Mr. Pike to be absent from his rooms at the relevant time through a fabricated letter. He paused. That individual is Mr. Silas Kedge. Kedge said nothing. His expression did not change with any discernible suddenness. It underwent a very gradual adjustment, from professional composure towards something more carefully neutral, the adjustment of a man who has decided that the correct response to a direct accusation is to require that it be proven. "That is a serious allegation," he said at last. "It is," Holmes agreed. "Let me support it." He did so methodically and without theatrical emphasis, moving through the evidence as a barrister addresses a jury, not to produce drama but to produce comprehension. The legal archaism in the forged writ, traceable to a training conducted before the 1868 reforms, the same underlying stroke sequence in both the forged writ and the substitute pleading, placing their author as someone trained in copying forms rather than composing them freely. The theatrical costumier in Maiden Lane, whose description of the man calling himself Forsyth matched in every physical particular the description in the legal directories of a younger Silas Kedge. The identity of Gerald Stanton, managing clerk of Pendleton and Marsh, who had existed for precisely the duration of the Bellamy inheritance settlement and had vanished without professional trace the year after it concluded. The mild Kentish accent of James Tolliver, the forgettable messenger, and Kedge's unguarded familiarity with the eastern reaches of Kent when caught off balance by a casual reference. Colonel Bellamy shifted in his chair at the mention of the inheritance settlement. Miss Vane was very still. Mr. Samuel Bellamy, Holmes continued, worked as a legal copyist under a name other than his own. In that capacity he had access to archived records from the period of his family's inheritance settlement. He found within those records evidence that the managing clerk Gerald Stanton, whose hand appears on several critical documents, had used a false identity to manipulate the settlement in ways that reduced the Bellamy interest considerably. He identified that Gerald Stanton and Silas Kedge were the same man. He began to make a public record of what inheritance fraud looked like, not abstractly, but from direct knowledge of a specific instance. And when it became clear that a writ of habeas corpus would shortly bring him before a judge, where he would be legally positioned to speak with the protections of a court proceeding, Mr. Kedge acted. Kedge's breathing had changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly. He drew the next breath with a slight deliberateness, and released it with the same. 3 details place the crime upon you rather than upon any other person in this room, Holmes said, addressing him directly now. First, your use of an outdated legal qualifier, a phrase no practitioner trained after 1868 would reproduce, in both of the false documents you produced. Second, your reflexive correction of a deliberate legal error I introduced into our conversation on Sunday, before conscious consideration could intervene, which establishes your legal training as something automatic and therefore very early. And third, your response when I mentioned Kent, which told me that you know the eastern reaches of that county with the familiarity of someone who spent formative years there, and that you have kept that connection carefully from your professional biography. He turned to Lestrade. The original writ will be found, I believe, in a deed box held at Kedge's offices under a client name that does not correspond to any active client. I suggest we begin with the name Harrington, or possibly Forsyth, which is the alias he used at the costumier's and which men of a certain habit tend to reuse. Kedge stood. He did it quietly, without haste, as a man rises from a dinner table. He looked at Holmes for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read precisely, but which I thought contained, beneath its surface, a quality of recognition. Not of guilt acknowledged, but of craft acknowledged, the look of one technician identifying another. "You have been thorough," he said. "You were thorough also," Holmes replied without irony. "The construction of James Tolliver alone was a considerable achievement. It is a pity that the pressure of the investigation compelled you to work faster than your best pace." Lestrade stepped forward and said what was required. Kedge offered no resistance, which did not surprise me. He was not a man for whom resistance, at this stage, would have seemed professionally appropriate. He went with the constable to the door and paused there, looking back at the room with an expression I found myself, despite everything, unable to wholly condemn. It was the expression of a man who had built very carefully for a very long time, and who had at last run out of ground to build upon. Then he was gone, and the room breathed again, and Miss Clara Vane pressed both hands flat upon her knees and looked at the floor for a long moment before she looked up. Chapter 10. Liberty Restored. The deed box was found under the name Forsyth. Lestrade's men located it at Kedge's offices in Gray's Inn that same Monday afternoon, in a cabinet of client files arranged alphabetically, sitting between a folder labelled Fenton and one labelled Foster, with the unremarkable patience of a thing that has been waiting quietly for someone to look in the right place. The original writ of Habeas Corpus was inside it, folded precisely, undamaged, and bearing the genuine seal impression whose edge behaviour Holmes had described to Lestrade as though reading from a technical manual. The writ was presented to the appropriate court officer before 5 o'clock that afternoon. Samuel Bellamy was brought before a magistrate on Tuesday morning. Holmes and I did not attend the hearing, as there was no reason connected with the investigation that required our presence, and Holmes has always held that the formal machinery of justice, once set properly in motion, operates most efficiently without the addition of spectators who have already served their purpose. I learnt the details from Harcourt, who had been present throughout and who communicated them in a note delivered to Baker Street before luncheon, his handwriting restored to its natural steadiness after the agitation of the preceding week. The magistrate heard the circumstances with the careful, slightly weary attention of a man accustomed to cases in which the law has been used against itself. He reviewed the writ, noted the period of detention, and ordered Samuel Bellamy's immediate release. The proceedings, Harcourt wrote, were brief and almost quiet. The quietness, I thought when I read this, of a correction being made rather than a verdict being delivered, of something being restored to its proper position after having been displaced. Holmes read the note, set it on the table, and said nothing for a time. Then he said, "Good," in the particular tone he reserves for outcomes that are correct rather than merely satisfying, and returned to the monograph he had been drafting on wood ash analysis, which the case had interrupted a full week earlier. Bellamy himself came to Baker Street 3 days after his release. He was a slight, composed man of perhaps 40, with the kind of face that reveals its intelligence gradually rather than all at once, and the careful manner of someone who has spent a considerable period in close quarters with his own thoughts. He shook Holmes's hand and mine with a firmness that conveyed genuine gratitude without excess, sat in the basket chair that Holmes indicated, and declined tea with a small apologetic smile. "I am told," he said, "that you understood the case before most of the evidence was in." "I understood its shape," Holmes replied. "The substance required a week's work." Bellamy nodded. "I want to ask you one thing, if I may. Kedge, what will happen to him?" "That is a question for the courts rather than for me. The immediate charge concerns the theft and the production of false legal documents. The older matter, the manipulation of your family's inheritance settlement through the false identity of Gerald Stanton, will be a separate proceeding, considerably more complex and more difficult to prove after nearly 20 years. But the documents exist. The records at Pendleton and Marsh were never destroyed, only buried under subsequent filings. Your own work in identifying the anomalies, preserved in your notes, will be material evidence." Bellamy was quiet for a moment. "It may amount to very little," he said. "In a legal sense." "It may," Holmes agreed. "The law is better at addressing what was done last week than what was done in 1875. That is one of its limitations, and not a small one." Something passed through Bellamy's expression at this, not bitterness precisely, but the measured acknowledgement of a man who has looked at an injustice long enough to understand its full dimensions. "My brother," he said after a moment, "has communicated through his solicitor something that approaches an apology for his conduct during my imprisonment and for what he has done since." "The proceedings against your estate," I said. "He has withdrawn them." Bellamy turned his hat in his hands once, then stopped. I do not think Adrian acted from malice precisely. He acted from fear, and from the conviction that family honour was best served by silence and accommodation rather than by truth. He may not be entirely wrong that our name has suffered, but he is wrong about what honour requires. He paused. We have not spoken directly. I'm not certain when we will. Holmes said nothing, which was, I've come to understand over many years, his manner of expressing that some things are beyond the reach of comment. Vernon Pike called on Wednesday, ostensibly to return a reference book he had borrowed from Holmes some months earlier, though as the book had not been noticeably missed, I suspected the return was a pretext for the sort of conversation a journalist finds irresistible when he has been, however briefly, at the centre of a case. He sat for 20 minutes, drank a glass of sherry, asked Holmes 3 questions that Holmes declined to answer in usable form, and left apparently satisfied nonetheless. As he went down the stairs, he could be heard remarking to no one in particular that the affair would make a very fine piece once the legal proceedings were concluded, and that he intended to call it something about the architecture of deception. He enjoyed it, I observed, when the door had closed. He enjoyed the aftermath, Holmes said. The night in custody was probably less pleasant, though I notice he did not say so. The last visit connected with the case came from Edward Harcourt, who arrived one evening in the second week of December with Clara Vane on his arm and an expression of entirely transparent happiness that he made no effort to conceal. They stayed for half an hour. Miss Vane spoke with Holmes about the Bellamy settlement proceedings, which Sir Julian had agreed to assist with pro bono, and displayed in that conversation the same precise, unhurried intelligence she had shown throughout the affair. Harcourt mostly watched her speak, which told me everything about his feelings that a month of observation had already made clear. When they had gone, Holmes picked up his violin and played for a while without choosing any particular piece, the aimless exploratory playing that I associated with a mind returning from active engagement to its ordinary state of readiness. I sat by the fire and thought about what Sir Julian had said when he had come, the day after Kedge's arrest, to express his thanks. He was a man not given to philosophising, and what he said was brief. He said that in 34 years of practice he had understood the law to be an instrument, and that instruments could be turned to any purpose, and that the only check upon their misuse was the willingness of people of conscience to notice when something was wrong and to say so. He thanked Holmes for noticing. Holmes had replied that the true credit belonged to Samuel Bellamy, who had noticed first, and had said so in pamphlets that anyone could read, if anyone chose to. I have recorded many of Holmes's remarks over the years, and have learned to distinguish between those that are made for effect and those that are made because they represent, as precisely as his extraordinary mind can render it, his actual view of a matter. That one, I am quite certain, was the latter. There is, I have come to believe, a particular kind of courage that belongs not to the soldier on a field or the officer in a burning building, but to the person who sits alone with a piece of paper and a great deal of knowledge and chooses to write what they know rather than what is safe. Samuel Bellamy had exercised that courage. It had cost him a cell, a month of his liberty and nearly his reputation. It had not, in the end, cost him the truth, which was what someone had most wished to take from him. The case of the stolen writ of habeas corpus was complete. Holmes played on into the evening, the fire burned low, and outside the Baker Street window the first real snow of winter came quietly down upon the city, covering the pavements and the rooftops and the ancient flagstones of Lincoln's Inn in an even, undiscriminating white, as though the year itself were choosing to begin again from a clean page.